This question is from Jean MacDonald from Port Leisha, and she asks, are the changes in the decision-making structures of the European Union under Lisbon, are they cause for concern for Ireland? Richard Boyd-Barrett.
Yes, they are. There's 53 different areas, according to the government white paper, which will move from unanimity, where there's a veto, to qualified majority voting, which means that policies in those areas can be imposed. Although it's worth saying as an aside that the government white paper on it says there's 53 areas, while as the supposedly independent referendum commission has about half that number. So the public isn't even getting accurate information about how many areas are going to move from unanimity to qualified majority voting. The other aspect I think that worries me is that there's nothing been done in Lisbon to deal with the democratic deficit, whereby the Commission, unelected Commission, is the only body that can propose legislation. So not only will Ireland lose a commissioner for 5 out of every 15 years under the treaty, but that insulates, if you like, the commissioners further from democratic accountability. But really, what Lisbon should have been doing, if it's supposedly about enhancing democracy in the Union, it should make those commissioners democratically accountable and elected. And of course, the last point is that the Ireland's voting weight in the European Council will be slashed, while the voting weight of big member states like Germany, France, Britain, and so on will be doubled or almost doubled. Okay, Lauren Pesh, a number of issues raised there in relation to the Commission, in relation to the Council of Ministers, and also in relation to qualified majority voting. And just to go back again briefly to the original question from Jean MacDonald, that's, are the changes in the decision-making structures of the EU under Lisbon, are they cause for concern for Ireland?
Now, just let me first clarify one thing. The EU already has a democratic system of government because legislation is decided between two institutions who are democratically elected. The Council of Ministers, representing the 27 national governments, including Ireland, of course, and the European Parliament, directly elected by the peoples of Europe. So there is no democratic deficit. And with respect to the Lisbon Treaty, on the contrary, for the first time, it gives formal powers to the national parliaments. So if you believe in associating national parliaments to the decision-making process in Europe, then you should vote yes to the Lisbon Treaty. There is no democratic deficit, and the Lisbon Treaty, on the contrary, is going to further increase the democratic credentials of the EU. Now, to talk about the Commission, now, I'm afraid you misunderstood the role of the Commission. The Commission is not the equivalent of a government. The Commission is a technical body whose role is simply to put forward legislative proposals. The Commission does not have the final say on legislation. Having said that, it's also important to realize that commissioners are selected by all the national governments and the European Parliament. And if the European Parliament is not satisfied with the Commission, the Parliament has a power already. And this has nothing to do with the Lisbon Treaty. The European Parliament has a power to compel the Commission to resign. So it is simply deeply misguided to accuse the Commission, to accuse the EU of being undemocratic. Okay, Kieran Allen, the same question to you.
Well, first of all, we are transferring powers, more powers, either 50 or 25, depends how you calculate it, to an EU superstate. That superstate will have its own president, it'll have its own foreign ministry, it will have a new external action force, a diplomatic service of approximately 7,000 people. And what people have to ask is, I personally am not, if you like, a nationalist, but if you're transferring power to an international body, are you getting more or less democracy? That's the key question. Are you getting more or less democracy? And I would argue you're getting less democracy. For one thing, the EU Commission, which is unelected, are the only group in Europe who can draft laws that go either to the Council or to the Parliament, right? We can elect anybody here, and you, if you're, Rachel, if you're elected to the Parliament, the Dáil, you might be able to draft a law. But you cannot do that in the European Parliament. Now, that's a diminution of democracy rather than an increase in democracy. And the last point I want to make is this is a very well-established academic literature that there's a democratic deficit in Europe. And I'm surprised people say there's no democratic deficit. In fact, the main defender of the European Union, a man called Maggione, says the problem with the democratic deficit argument is it's too much emphasis on democracy. Of course there's a democratic deficit, but we can't always have majoritarian rule. And this is the problem. There is really a democratic deficit in Europe, and this has not been addressed by the Lisbon Treaty.
Gavin Barrett, maybe you might like to pick up on that question of a democratic deficit. And again, that's something that has been mentioned by many people throughout this campaign, and then maybe move on to the original question asked by Jean.
Well, in terms of democratic reforms, asking ourselves, will we be better or worse off after the Treaty of Lisbon? I think we'll clearly be better off after the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force. For example, under the existing treaties, national parliaments are given an extremely limited role. They're given a much better role under the Treaty of Lisbon, and hopefully that will be one which will increase the amount of debate on European issues at national level and increase the amount of democratic control at national level. There's also something that's forgotten in this regard. It's not just a question of parliaments. There's also a much bigger role for the European Court of Justice in the Justice and Home Affairs area. And I think that's crucial, because if laws are being adopted there, it's crucial that you have appropriate judicial control over them. Kieran mentioned about a massive transfer of powers to the European Union. Of course, that's wrong. There isn't a massive transfer of powers. There's very little transfer of power to the European Union under the Treaty of Lisbon. What there is some changes in terms of unanimity voting to qualified majority voting. In other words, powers the European Union already has are being shifted to majority voting. And we have to have that at European Union level, because if you don't decide things in an organisation with 27 members by some form of majority voting, you won't get any decisions.
What, though, specifically of the commissioner question? The fact that for 5 years out of every 15, we won't have a commissioner, we won't have a voice at the table.
Okay, well, I think the ability of the no side to raise the Commission issue in this particular referendum campaign has been extraordinary for me, because the question of having a commissioner, a permanent commissioner, was decided in the Treaty of Nice. The Treaty of Nice already stated in Article 213 of the existing EC Treaty, as inserted by the Treaty of Nice, it already says that there will no longer be a permanent commissioner per member state. And what the Treaty of Lisbon actually does from 2009, what the Treaty of Lisbon does is it postpones it until 2014. It actually makes it reversible, which the present treaties do not. And the other thing it does is it fills in the details for how long exactly it will take place. But under the existing treaties, I do not believe we would have got a better deal.
Kieran Allen, those points that what we're actually talking about here is more democracy, and there will in particular be more power for national parliaments.
Well, again, this has been greatly exaggerated by the yes side. What actually is the case is that if in a period of 8 weeks, 1/3 of national parliaments agree that the EU has overstepped its limits only on the grounds of subsidiarity, not on general policy making, in that 8 weeks, the EU will consider the matter, right? That's what you're getting. If in that 8-week period, a half of parliaments, of all the parliaments in Europe, decide on the issue of subsidiarity, the EU has breached its limits, it will go back for, if you like, a more decision making. So, that's what
essentially, are you saying this is minor league stuff?
Absolutely minor stuff, right? And what you're trading for that is actually, as he admitted, you're giving away more areas where there was a national veto and where the local parliament could decide things to the EU. And what I want to focus on is actually the question of talks at the World Trade Organization, because there's been a lot of misconceptions on this. And the fact of the matter is that in the last treaty, the issue on discussions on health, education and social services, the veto on those ones was put in the language of it's a shared competence, it's a common accord, it has to be concluded jointly. Now we're hearing that has been severely weakened, and the only ground you can claim a veto in these vital areas of services is if you can prove that they are actually that the national service is being disrupted. And who will you prove that to? The European Court of Justice, which is actually pushing through text.
Right. I want to get a specific response, first of all, from Dr. Gavin Barrett on the question of democracy, that we're giving a lot away and we're getting back very little.
Well, I don't agree with that. Of course, what wasn't mentioned by Kieran there is that in areas that are transferred to majority decision-making at European Union level, simultaneously what happens is that the European Parliament, the democratically elected European Parliament, is given a right of veto over those areas. So there's more democratic control over there that we don't have at the moment. So that's one point. Also, his summary of the provisions relating to national parliaments was inaccurate. The first part of it was correct. We can get them to reconsider it. But if there are a sufficient number of votes, the process can actually lead, provided the national parliaments, or a sufficient number of them, can get the agreement of either the Council or the Parliament to block legislation, which is a historic first. And there are other provisions as well relating to national parliaments as well. It's not just the subsidiarity mechanism that's in there. There are other provisions there as well which need to be considered as well.
Were you inaccurate, Kieran Allen?
Not at all, no. I mean, what I actually said was, if, and just people listen carefully, if in an 8-week period, with all the vast amounts of EU legislation, more than half of parliaments in that 8-week time slot on the issue of subsidiarity agree agree something, then it's got to go back for majority on the EU Council or the EU Parliament. That's the case. Now, if you think that is sufficient compensation for giving up a strong veto on the area, for example, the negotiations of the World Trade Organization on services, I don't think that's a sufficiently strong
A brief
veto.
response, Gavin Barrett, and then I'm going to move on to our next question.
Okay, Kieran has got his figures wrong. For a start, it's a third of national parliaments can actually get the matter reconsidered, and a majority of national parliaments, provided they get the Parliament or the Council to agree with them, can get it blocked.
That's what I said.
Okay, thank you for your responses on that one.